If I may, we're going to call the... Okay, go? Right, we're going to call the May 22, 2019 meeting of the Ojai Building Appeals Board to order. 6:01. I guess we'll start with a roll call.
Okay. Chair Ulrich?
Here.
Member Farmer?
Here.
Member Murphy?
Here.
Member Daddy?
Here.
And myself, Member Henson. We're all here.
Okay, and we'll do the Pledge of Allegiance. And Judy, if you would.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, public communications. It's the time set aside during Building Appeals Board meeting for members of the public to address the Building Appeals Board on items of city business other than scheduled agenda items. Matters raised at this time may be briefly discussed by the board and will generally be referred to staff and or placed on a subsequent agenda. Under state law, other than for emergency items, no action on non-agendized items can be taken at the meeting. Having no speaker cards, and seeing no members of the public in the... Don't rub it in. Don't rub it in. Yes, okay. Next we come to the building officials report.
No report.
If any. Very good, thank you. Consent item is the minutes of the Building Appeals Board meeting of October 10, 2018. That wasn't the last time we convened, was it?
I think so.
I hate when that happens. Okay. And that's, is that a voice vote?
Is that what?
Is that a voice vote being on a consent?
Make a motion that we accept the minutes as presented.
Okay, as presented. Yes, Chair Ulrich? I don't think we need to take roll call for this.
No, I think it's a voice vote.
It's a voice vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
Okay. Discussion item is discuss Chapter 9 Fire Protective Systems of the California Building Code. So my understanding is we have some clarification that can be made over what is in the Chapter 9 Fire Protective Systems of the California Building Code and how we would approach discussion and or recommendations to the council from the building official, Mr. Jesuiak. So would you please reiterate, if you will, what you were saying earlier?
The discussion that we were having earlier, I was referring to the actual second item. I wasn't referring to this item.
Oh, okay.
Sorry about that.
In that case, what would you have to say about Chapter 9 Fire Protective Systems of the California Building Code at this point regarding the status as in most recent iteration and what the city's adoption of whole or in part of that?
So the city fire protection systems are, the permits for those are reviewed, plans are reviewed by, inspected, issued, and approved by the Ventura County Fire Department. So all of the fire protection systems, any alarms, any in buildings, those are all approved through the fire department.
And this is for residential only?
Oh,
Okay.
this is for all systems.
Does that also include temperature sensing devices?
The only one that wouldn't be would be the one that is required through the local amendment that we did in the garage for the heat sensor in the garage for the building permit
Okay,
requirement.
that would not be?
Correct.
Would not be what?
Would not be through the fire department.
Otherwise, they wouldn't be monitoring
It's a local
that,
code.
right?
It's a local.
Okay, but it's a local code from, that is administered by Ventura County Fire Department. No, it's then
When we do our issuance of permits, they're then notified, over $500 that they're required to put the heat sensor in the garage,
Right.
right? So that is administered and approved by the building department.
How about heat sensors in an attic space in a commercial building?
That's, so you get it, it's, page 324. It's section 907 dash 2 dash 3 dot 62.
Say this again?
Upper left corner of the page.
907 2362.
Okay. So that is specifically for,
Page 324.
yeah,
You gotta have different printing. This is
Nope.
324.
yep, I have it. I'm just saying what the subsection is. That would be a requirement and administered by the fire department. Heat sensors, yeah, where sprinklers or smoke detectors are not installed.
What kind of condition would that be? I mean, what kind of a
So
structure or use?
they would say in their plan review, just because a system is not installed doesn't mean that they don't have other requirements to their system. So there is a plan review or a 126 form from the fire department that says they've reviewed it and these are the conditions that they have to meet. It doesn't necessarily mean that a fire sprinkler system or fire suppression system or any of those have to be installed.
But in lieu of that, a heat detector would be required, according to this.
According to this, yes.
I mean, it
I'm
says
not
shall
sure.
be, so.
Yes. Well, again, that would be administered by the fire department.
Okay, so,
So,
right.
I have a question. Before we go into conditions of this commercial stuff. One of these days, the Oaks is gonna open up that small hotel. One of these days, I imagine the White House is gonna open up. And one of these days, in some form or another, possibly the bowling alley is gonna open up.
Bob, I don't think the public can hear what you're talking about. I can't hear you.
The public can't hear me. When we've had buildings that have been shut for a period of time, are they conditioned to the newest code? I keep seeing programs come up in the city, and it's kind of like we're acting as though they've been in continuous building and are exempt from all kinds of different things on projects. And I'm just wondering, when buildings reopen, and they're not going to be the same occupancy, are they going to be conditioned to follow all of these new guidelines? They're going to have to go back and retrofit? Is that something that?
change of use requires review by the fire department. So therefore, like for this case, they would have to follow the rules of the fire department. Whether a fire suppression system, fire protection system is required depends on various items. As far as any work that they do has to be brought up to current code, and that is reviewed by the building department, by the planning department, by the public works department if there's improvements, by multiple agencies prior to issuance.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, and just also to be clear, and for the public, the Chapter 9 of the 2016 California Building Code has been adopted by the city, or?
Yes, it's been adopted. It's been adopted. We have not modified any sections in this
Okay.
section.
And at this point, this conforms, and the city's adoption any exceptions to Chapter 9 in its entirety as part of the California Building Code? Are there any exceptions that pertain specifically to the city of Ojai as a consequence of the adoption by the council?
I'm not exactly sure what the question is.
Are there any, in the entirety of Chapter 9 has been adopted by the city? There's no exceptions? Or-
Correct. Now, we don't have any exceptions. Again, this is fire's responsibility, so there may be additional, we can't make anything less restrictive than this. Fire may have higher requirements, but I cannot answer those questions.
Okay, and when you say that, since this is the building code, when you say it's Ventura County Fire's responsibility, how does that practically work? In other words, and once again, for the public, the explication of when a fire sprinkler fire protection system is required, a fire alarm system, a fire alarm monitoring, etc. That is typically speaking a condition of approval by the Ventura County Fire Department, separate set of plans from what?
It's a separate submittal.
Yes.
And prior to issuance, we have to receive documentation from the fire department that they are okay for us to issue permits. And then before we could final permits, the fire department has to sign off on permits.
And that would typically include the totality of a system, an underground fire service, the above ground in the building fire sprinkler system, and if required, a fire alarm system.
As determined by the fire department.
Okay, in other words, they can phase it, where depending upon the nature of a project, they can say, okay, we approve the underground component of it because we're still reviewing the buildings. Or,
I'm not exactly sure of the
Okay,
fire
right.
department's approval system,
well, but.
mechanism.
Okay, but what you're saying is that you need complete clearance from the fire department before you can issue a building permit.
Correct.
And ostensibly,
I would assume that they would have a full set or comfortable where they're at. There's always modifications that can be made, and changes.
all right. Okay, does anyone have any discussion at this particular point? Any
Yeah.
questions?
I have.
Good, good.
So just to cut to the chase, the reason that we're here tonight is since the council's already adopted this, it's for us to review it and see whether or not if we have any changes, is that it?
To answer that question, so this meeting was requested by Chair Ulrich and Board Member Daddy. I know on the second item, Chapter 9, I know that we're going to talk about adopting that. I'm not sure why this item is on the agenda.
Okay.
So I think that would be a question for Chair
Well,
Ulrich.
actually, we've already addressed the reasons. I wanted confirmation and affirmation in the public context of what the applicability of this Chapter 9 is. And actually, I still have a couple of, there's references starting with Section 901 general to, and certainly 903 to occupancy types. Where is there an occupancy matrix?
It's further in the chapter,
Okay.
earlier chapter in the building code.
An earlier chapter, okay.
Yes.
Wow. Okay, from a practical perspective, from a user perspective, and also from an applicant's comprehending on what they're dealing with before they go into something, and this is strictly from the city's aspect of it, I think. Without having that matrix in the front of this, it's almost, you really have to relate everything, going back to an earlier chapter. So I'm just saying also from the perspective of having it in the packet, it's kind of like,
I understand. I guess we weren't sure what this item was on the agenda for. If we had known what the item was on, we could have been better prepared.
I won't, this, the requirements and and their practical application has come to my attention, and that's the reason I asked this, and on at least two instances where there seems to be, it's very difficult, let's put it this way, it's very difficult for the applicant to access what the requirements may or may not be. You've got two agencies here, and from a practical perspective, since an applicant for a permit in this city is going to come to the city first, they're, perhaps if they're experienced, sophisticated, the cognoscenti, they will know to go to the fire department first. But even then, there are oftentimes complications or inconsistencies in the application of this what I'm addressing is accessibility to an applicant. The city's challenged that way. I don't think I think that's an open, if it's a secret at all, it's open secret. And simply stated, this is a function of making it as easy for both staff and the applicant to access, to understand this stuff. Because this chapter seems to indicate that pretty much everything is sprinkled. And one distinction, which we'll come to later, has to do with what the fire hazard rating is, which from a practical perspective doesn't just apply, that issue doesn't just apply to new construction or development, that applies to the entire community. So I think our interest is in getting things so we're all, ostensibly all, as much as we can be on the same page of music. With the anticipation of there's going to be, as Board Member Daddy referenced, with the anticipation that there's going to be some new commercial structures and uses coming online in the near term, as well as in the long term. I think what I'm trying to say is I'm fairly familiar with this stuff, and yet I look at how difficult it is to access and having to go back and forth. And your basic applicant, I don't think is it's daunting. So that this is just the human element, really, and like I said, then we have the which our city staff, meaning no disrespect, our city has a history of inconsistencies, and as I've pointed out a couple of times, when the inconsistency becomes the rule, if it's serious enough, or repeated enough, or repeated long enough. So, then what do you have? So, in any case.
It's not easy for the applicant.
Well, yeah, but I mean, yeah, exactly. So it's not easy for the applicant, and this is going to we're going to have some applicants coming on, I don't know whether it has anything to do with us being as a much discussed tourist destination, but it sure seems that way. So, in any case, anybody else? Comments?
Yeah, I
Discussion?
want to get back in this again. So the commercial has not been adopted by the city. 7A has not been adopted.
That is the next item on the agenda.
Okay, so that's the next item.
Yeah.
What in this item? I'm taking a look at a number of these things, and on page 307, I keep going over these over and over and over to group 1, group 2, group 3. And we kind of say the same thing, almost exactly the same, with a little bit of a difference.
So the difference between group A1, A2, and A3 are
Yep.
the types of assemblies. So those are assembly occupancies.
Correct.
So then you keep going through. Group B is an education. A group B is a business. Group M is a mercantile.
Okay, let's
And
say
they're all defined earlier in a previous chapter in the building.
that we
code.
don't have reference.
You don't have here. I mean, the problem is that
No, I'm just trying to get a handle on it because.
we can't copy the entire code book.
No,
you know what I'm
that's,
saying?
that's okay. I'm taking a look at the square footage and the occupancy load, and it really seems that we either need to reduce it or get some consistency. I don't really see where a 5,000 square foot under 2 and 100 or more load
So those,
allows a different, then we go into another one where we have virtually the same thing. So 1 and 3 are pretty much the same at 12,000 feet and 300 person load. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to, number one, I don't know that it's relevant because of the 12,000 foot buildings in this community are maybe non-existent. Why we figure that the difference in occupancies, I'm not really sure on the load, because what I would think of is the assembly of occupancies, which is under 6, where the occupied, we have, when we start talking about a load of 100, a load of 300 different loads, there's got to be something in here that talks about, I would say, exits and other things. And all of these buildings are going to be sprinklered, right?
all of that is all under different chapters. We
Hmm.
have egress, we have, paths of travel, we have occupancy use. So that's the reason why you have different occupant loads and different numbers for those, is because a group 1A is different, has a different category than different use than a group 2A, which has a different use than a group 3A. That's why there are different groups. It's not that you're just choosing which
It's just
group
kind of
it
like
is.
a shotgun effect, and I mean, if it covers it, it covers it. Then if you don't agree with it, then you come back and talk to the building official.
No, this
No.
is fire department.
No,
I mean, the fire.
so it has nothing to do with that. When they apply, they tell us what their use is, and then based on that, the square footage, we could calculate occupant loads. That's based on use also. So, and then, if you have a restaurant, there's many different factors. If you have an assembly like this here, chairs like that, standing room, all have different factors that have to be taken into account. So if this is standing room, if this is seating, tables and chairs, if it's a banquet room, all of that takes into account to occupant load. And then all of that, egress, the width of the doors, all of that, all has to take into account based on number of occupants and distance of travel and all of that. If it's sprinklered or non-sprinklered, the buildings. All of that is taken into account when we're doing our plan checks. So that's why it's not as easy as, well, why is this 300, this 100, this 300? It's because it really specifies the type of use, whether it's a banquet hall like they just built at the inn, at the Ojai Valley Inn, or it's a movie theater. They're both assemblies, but they're different types of assemblies. They have different seating arrangements and things like that. All of that comes into play. Now, in this particular section, they're saying when an automatic sprinkler is going to be required for these uses. That's what this is saying.
Okay, having said that, and kind of returning to my issue, my concern regarding applicants, where an applicant comes in, the first thing they're going to do is put in an application for zoning clearance, correct?
Well, it would be submitted through planning, and
Okay.
whether it can be submitted to planning and building at the same time,
Okay.
that's
Right,
dependent on what it is.
well, ultimately, planning has to look at it before building and safety will issue anything, notwithstanding, it's a kind of a condition precedent, so, okay. Where would an applicant, and where in the process would an applicant be advised of, they're gonna have to go and get separate clearances from the fire, of Ventura County Fire?
As soon as it's submitted, at the counter, when they're submitted, we notify them, or if they're not notified then, the latest would be at plan check. First plan check, it's usually written on there also, that fire department approval or health department approval if it's a restaurant.
Okay, well, obviously, at plan check, it's already, if that's when they're finding out about it, that's already delaying things. right? Because plan check might go forward, or you're saying without that?
Well, I can't,
Or is that a condition precedent to plan check?
well, it would be first submittal, so that would be.
So it is a condition precedent to further plan check.
Well, it doesn't, it's just notification. We can't tell you when to submit to fire, but it could
Oh,
be done simultaneously.
You will, so concurrently, you'll be doing plan check while fire is processing a separate submittal. Okay, all right? Is that clear to everybody? All right? Do we have any questions from an applicant perspective that about,
I have a question.
yes?
So, it's always been on my mind, when sprinklers are installed, how
When
are
they're
they-
required.
if they're required and they're installed, how are they tested?
So that they do have testing that is done.
How do they do that?
Depends on the system.
There's, yeah,
I mean, if it's in a home, you can't turn them on.
No, they
pressure test.
They do a pressure test. They release air, and they'll put on the sprinkler heads.
Uh-huh.
They'll put a balloon, and then they'll release the air,
Yeah.
and then the balloon will fill up to verify that all of the heads in that system are working.
Because I've heard of instances where they didn't work.
Mhm.
I wondered, oh, you got to test them. I wondered.
So
Okay.
it also
I've heard of
depends
that.
on, there are different types of systems,
Yeah,
but typically that's how they test them.
Okay.
They charge them with air and then release it.
okay. Thank you.
In commercial, there may be a hydro test where it's done under, water pressure as well, where if there's a leak, and sometimes that occurs, it's not a big deal. It's better to find out then before everything gets covered up,
Yeah.
okay? So,
Okay, so Chair, to proceed, do we need a motion to go ahead and accept the commercial?
It's already been accepted.
Yeah,
Okay,
I-
so the
It's already been
commercial has
adopted.
been accepted and
From-
adopted.
well,
This is
actually, in
done.
keeping with the reason it's here, and also, some of the questions and the responses, from my perspective, something getting as far as plan check before, which may be the first time that someone's made aware of this and aware of their responsibilities under it. I would like to, in the interests of ease of processing, I would like to make a recommendation to council that the Chapter 9 is, and the requirements for it, which would include having the uses, the group information that allows this to be translatable, be somewhere in an applicant, a building permit applicant checklist, so that everyone knows about it as soon as possible. Because for some folks, which includes adaptation of existing structures, this could be a deal breaker. And let's not waste anybody's time any more than we need to, okay? Because this, to me, like, as I said, we have a history of inconsistent application, and that applies to the fire department as well. So the reality of it is, I would submit that we could make a recommendation to council that the Chapter 9 and the group designations are indicated on a building permit checklist.
So,
Is there a building permit checklist now?
Is there one?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay,
So is that the recommendation, to have a
Get
plan
one.
check,
think we should have
building
one.
permit, plan check?
they've talked
huge
about-
requirement,
Checklist.
huge requirement. You got planning taking a look at things, you got the building department taking a look at things, you got Ventura County Fire looking at things. And that's for, as I said, we're all looking at this and assuming it's like new construction, but the reality of the situation is the first thing we're gonna be seeing in the near term are gonna be reuses, or folks asking for permits to operate a certain type of business in an existing structure, okay?
So are you asking for a checklist for individual groups, like if someone's under group
Well,
A?
okay, we just heard that there isn't a checklist, so from my perspective
That's
is,
what
you know,
you're asking.
I think if you go to the county, you get a checklist.
But let
Right.
me ask my question. So for group A, or two or three, let's say group three, someone comes on and they're in group three. You're asking for a checklist specifically for that. They don't have to go through all of this, just for their group, a checklist.
Well, no, a building department checklist that basically, that says, Chapter 9, Ventura County Fire Department will have issue a separate permit.
Yeah.
And that Chapter 9 controls, and that these groups, so that they can see what group they may fit in
At the
themselves.
counter, would they tell you what group you're in?
Yeah, that's what I want to know. How do you know if I
Who knows
go?
what group you're in, unless you look at the building code? Go
So,
back to the
so-
book.
well, a lot, commercial use is typically submitted by a architect or engineer, or it could be the owner, but all the plans are stamped by an architect or an engineer, which on those plans, it tells you the use on there, it tells you all the square footage, or at least it should. If it doesn't, that's a plan check correction.
So then it's up to you to determine what group you're in.
Yeah, it's up
Or
to,
your
it's up to
architect.
the applicant to tell us how they're being used.
That's what-
And that is where, once they tell us that, then we can determine what is required.
To me, that could get a little confusing, because there's so many groups down
Yeah,
here.
right.
And one group's 12,000 square foot, the other one's 5,000 square foot for 100 or more, the other one's 300 or more. I mean, for me, if I had gone in for a building permit or whatever, talking to somebody at the counter, they told me I was in group 2, I'd probably go fall in line with somebody.
But wouldn't your architect tell you that in advance, what group you're in?
Some
I
people
mean-
don't use architects, some people use, you know,
So for residential, we don't necessarily require an architect or an engineer, depending on what work is being done and if an engineer is,
right.
or an architect is required to do certain calculations. For a non-residential, we do require that all submittals be stamped by a architect or engineer.
And he would know, or she would know.
They would know, yes.
Okay, so, and I'll slightly amend what I just said. The recommendation, I'd like a resolution that recommends to the city council that that the building department adopt a checklist for applicants. Doesn't, you don't have to apply, the boxes don't have to apply, but at least we'll have a checklist, and that specifically, it would reference the Ventura County Fire Department, Chapter 9, if it's commercial, and then also a specific reference to the matrix table, what have you, for the group designations. Just so someone gets a sense of things before they have to go to an architect to be told what, in fact, their use would be.
So the other thing anybody can do is they can come to the counter, or they can call us and ask us and let them know what they want to do. We also have copies of all the building codes available for public use. And so if anybody's got questions, they can, before they get to that point at which they're getting an architect or an engineer, we can let them know where they're going to go. And then calling down to the fire department and asking, okay, we're going to do this. What are your requirements going to be? That is another option.
Yeah, but see, the problem is it's all oral, it's all verbal. You
I
may
think
have a document, or you may have a book of codes there, but the issue is, and I keep coming back to the city not having a checklist. And I've
At a
had the
recent
experience.
City council
I've-
meeting, they said they were going to do that. They talked about it.
Well,
Let's
and-
put that.
For
Okay.
years, for decades,
Yes,
actually.
so we're making a
Okay.
recommendation. I'd like
No.
a resolution to make
I
the
think that's good.
recommendation that
Okay.
that the council actually does it,
Do you want to make a
rather
motion
than,
like that we recommend?
okay, all right. Then the resolution I would submit is that the council require a building department checklist for applicants for residentials and commercial projects.
I second that.
A question, was that required or supply?
Require that the building department supply,
Okay.
okay?
You know, when they come in for their conceptual review, Tom, is this disclosed at that time too, or no?
Conceptual review.
Yeah,
All right,
they're
it's
telling
well
me-
before it even gets to me.
Okay.
Yeah. That's planning
That's up
thingy.
to them
It's
to
Title
ask,
10.
and they can do all their homework or whatever
Right.
during that time.
Again, I mean, if you're coming in with a conceptual review, you're gonna be doing your homework ahead of time on,
Right.
well, how much is a water line gonna cost? How, you know, because I may have to do 2 water lines,
Yeah.
2 tie-ins.
If we have a checklist, it's like a menu.
Yeah.
It's saying, well, you may need this, 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 and this, and just advises people, and it's a starting point without it being, well, I was told, because how much, I have familiarity with that. I'm sure several people on this board, as well as we know several citizens who have had experiences where that was just not clear, as clear as it could be.
Do we need to
We
take
have a
vote?
second, we have to take a vote?
Yeah, so is it a voice vote or by name? Voice, okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, passes.
Okay, in that case, then I believe we're done with discussion item 2, so shall we move to discussion item 3? All right, discussion item 3 is discuss chapter 7A, materials and construction methods for exterior wildfire exposure. This is supposed to say what, per the California Building Code?
Yes.
Okay. Recommendations. Consider a recommendation to council regarding Chapter 7A, materials and construction methods for exterior wildfire exposure per the California Building Code. And from a discussion perspective, Building Appeals Board member Daddy requested on May 16th that the Building Appeals Board meet to discuss Chapter 7A, materials and construction methods for exterior wildfire exposure per the California Building Code.
Now, is this the section that we didn't adopt with the rest of the stuff that we're gonna adopt citywide? Do I get that correct?
This section is adopted. However, this only applies to
Severe,
severe new buildings in severe high fire severity zones. In the residential code, we adopted chapter 337. Okay, it's already adopted. We modified it to include moderate, high, and very high fire zones, which would then cover the entire city. So all residential buildings are complying with this with additional modifications. Essentially, R337 in the residential code is almost verbatim as 7A, which is non-residential. Okay, so if you want to take the same adoptions that we did in the residential code and apply it to the commercial or non-residential, that can be done. I would recommend that we wait until we do code adoption, which is coming up again. There's going to be a new code released for January 1st. And as of January 1st, we have to re-adopt codes. We're going to be bringing that back hopefully in August to the BAB so that we can get it to council in September so that we can get through that whole long process of approval and ready to go for January 1st.
What happens if we don't hit the January 1st, or more specifically, if council doesn't hit it?
What happens then is we just go back to the default building code
16.
and all the modifications that we applied don't apply.
Okay, but if, that's assuming we have a gradient of moderate, high, and very high fire. What happens if the entire community is designated as a very high fire hazard severity zone?
Then this would just apply as is.
Okay, and at present, we only have 272 of the 3,500 residential properties that are in the very high.
Right.
So-
But
so-
residential is already being applied because we
Right.
adopted a modification to it that pretty much, that includes the entire city because we modified this code to say in a moderate a high and a very high severity zone.
Okay.
That was end.
Yes, and. So the city on the residential side is, yeah, and. The city on the residential side is completely covered by this section. Non-residential is still applied only to the very high fire severity zone.
Okay. And what is VMU?
It depends on the location. It's got nothing to do with use. It depends on the fire map by CAL FIRE. It
Well,
depends on that.
I'm talking in city, we don't have a single VMU in the very high in the fire designated map.
Okay.
So all of the almost 500 residences that we have in VMU, are they under the building code or not?
You can't look at zoning classification versus building classification.
Hmm?
So single-family homes and two-family homes are covered under that.
But a VMU could be a business.
It could be a business.
Okay, so it is, then it's use, it's not to, it is the zoning.
Well, it's the use as defined per construction. So if it's being used,
Now we're back to the group.
no.
No,
Yeah,
designations?
Yes,
Yeah.
we're back to the group. So if
Once
it's a
again.
residence, if it's an R3 in the building code, then that would apply. But if it's a non-residential use, according to the building code, then it
It's a
would
group.
not apply at this time unless it's in a very high fire severity zone.
Right.
And if it were a multi-use, we've got residence insurance, we've got residence, and we've got certain types of antique equipment where we have a condo, which is residence on the top story on Montgomery, and it's VMU. We have a church across the street on Montgomery where we've got music school, and we have mixed residence. Where are we going to do that? Predominant use of the building?
So the use that is applied is the use that is there. So if it's an R3, then it would apply. If it's a single-family home, then it would apply. If it's a two-family home, a duplex, it would apply. If it doesn't, if it's not, then it wouldn't.
Okay,
So
There
Hinkley's.
is a section in the residential code that talks about mixed use. So depending on how that is defined, would depend on whether it applies or not.
Okay, so the bed and breakfast we have on the top of Signal Street,
That's a business.
that's a business. Mechanics is a business.
That's all non-residentials.
Okay, so none of those are then in this
Single and
particular
Well,
code.
if the only way it would apply in a non-residential construction building would be, I have to back up here for a second, a new building in a very high fire severity zone. That's the way this is written right now. That for the non-residential. That's how Chapter 7A applies.
So what is the best way to modify after listening to our prior chief speak about a 2,000 yard ember cast, which is, pretty much wind blows 2 or 3 different directions over an hour period of time, and you pretty much have nothing left. That's out of not a designated fire zone, but an actual fire zone.
So, like I started off, if the BAB if the BAB wants to apply this to the same standards that we applied the residential section, I would recommend that we modify this section when we have the new code
2020.
because for the 2019 building code, because we're going to overlap and we're going to be chasing building code through at the same time by the time it gets to council. Does that make sense?
yeah, it does.
So we're planning on meeting, James, correct me if I'm wrong. We're planning on meeting hopefully late August to discuss the adoption of the 2019 California Building Code, which is going to be the same process that we had. Now, I'm planning on keeping everything the same that we have now, and we can modify this chapter. In addition, add that in so that we can just review it, approve it, and move on, unless there are other items that you would like to discuss.
What is the timeliness on this process? I know the CAL FIRE has been
So,
delayed. What is the timeliness? Are these guys on time every time? You will have it by August. Are they able to produce this type of work every 3 years on time?
yes, the building code has been released on time. It's usually released around to the public around mid-July. So once we get that, I need a little bit of time to make sure that all of our code amendments are lined up, to make sure they haven't added anything. So we have to get the changes, is what they call it, the changes from one code to the next. So once we get that, I have to review it, and then we could set up a meeting and present it to you, and then move forward from there. If you guys say, let's get this ready for that code, I will get this ready for that code, so we don't have to waste a time
Okay.
To get it to that point.
All right, we'll come back to that, because I think that's something that we would like to do at this point. But I'd also like to address a couple of things. One is, as of yet, the city hasn't adopted the recommended fire hazard severity map for the city that has been recommended to council by the Building Appeals Board. So,
Has it been presented?
Yes,
Well,
in April of
council?
2018.
yeah, they, what exactly was the, was council's direction?
So the direction at that time was to wait to see if CAL FIRE acted. We've come back and told them CAL FIRE hasn't acted. And I think when we brought this item to council, they said that they would consider the fire map in coming months, or I think one of the ideas was to look at this chapter in lieu of dealing with the fire map. So
In lieu of dealing with the fire map,
right. So
how would that work?
because what we just talked about, that this in effect kind of acts in the same way that it applies to the various hazard severity zones. So it was that this would function much the same way in that it includes the code updates without having to actually adopt the map, was the idea behind it.
Yeah, that seems like a backdoor way of trying to achieve something that's not achievable that way specifically, because obviously when you have a map that's available to the public and they could see versus an interpretation of language that is actually requires a negative interpretation as in inapplicability, and I always get confused with that stuff.
I think it depends like what you're trying to achieve with the fire map, though. Are we trying to ensure that the fire codes are as high as safe as possible, or are we just trying to get the word out that we're in a fire zone?
There's April of 2018,
Mhm.
which meant we made our recommendation in March of 2018, I think.
Mhm.
So now we're here in May of 2019. It's over. It's more swirl. There's a lack of will, or perhaps I'll characterize it as timidity upon part of a sufficient number of the council that they don't want to take the step. The fire map is nothing more than a graphic depiction of the actual hazard severity. I think it's well within it's been stated by retired and as well as active members of the Ventura County Fire Department that what usually saves the community is from being incinerated is the wind changes, just at the right time. And that's been my experience having gone through about 3 of these, maybe, big ones, since I've been here. And that, to me, is not recognizing reality, perhaps, for, I don't know whether it's political reasons or something else, but the bottom line on it is our map, as drawn rather badly, and I think everyone accepts that, by CAL FIRE in 2007, is not representative of conditions on the ground relative to this community. And granted, that applies, should the council, as we have recommended, adopt that map that indicates that the entire valley, or at least the entire city, is a very high fire hazard severity zone, that causes some changes and an extension of applicability to commercial of this particular chapter. I don't believe that's an egregious impact. No one's explained it to me that it is an egregious impact. There seems to be fear of the unknown, the what if, what could this mean? If it's concerned about insurance premiums, would seem to me to be like the least possible reason not to adopt it, because it's, once again, ignoring facts. And unless someone can demonstrate, perhaps, I haven't heard anyone, that really the city wouldn't burn in just the kind of fires we've had, except for the wind changing. The wind maintained in a particular direction, I don't understand why it wouldn't come right through the middle of the community, and we would be like Santa Rosa and Paradise. So having said that, to me, it serves notice. It's a graphic. It would be on the wall someplace for the community, as well as it's also my understanding, Board Member Daddy, what's the situation relative to insurance companies and their continued willingness
we don't
to...
waste our time with 13-year-old fire maps. We've drawn our own conclusions. We have our own results.
And that would be applicable to other insurance companies that may be still remaining in the insurance business in the city?
A number of companies modified years ago and came up with different factors. A number of companies have drawn artificial lines, which really don't have anything to do with the fire map. They've drawn their own lines. They
and those are for business purposes.
They understand what's contiguous, and so the line doesn't stop and the line doesn't start a fire, and the line doesn't prevent. So those things have been done before, and we've looked at the severity. We understand where we are, and we're looking at the fuel loads.
Yeah,
and we understand what that is, and so in reality today, if somebody feels comfortable that they live on Del Oro and they're below that pencil line and they're not in a fire hazard,
Lord love them.
yeah, and by the city now adopting the map, because I've thought about this a number of times, I wanted to get the map adopted because it would mandate a number of hardening. If we're going to harden everything, then I really don't have a problem adopting the map, because anybody that was here got to see what actually happened. And the entire valley is in a pretty much fire distressed area. So I don't really have a problem with the map as long as we're less than 3 months away. We literally get the new codes on time. We can deal with these things. We can get them done. Because as soon as we're just about finished with this thing, we will be in critical fire season at that time. With the amount of water we have and the excess fuel we have, massive amounts of fuel.
So the city's been functioning, and also from a perspective of an advisory and notice to the public. The city's been, and not that anyone could find it, because as I recall, I had asked the previous building official about this. When was that? 2016? Where's the current fire map? So at this point, we are still functioning on a grossly inaccurate 2007 map. From my perspective, Mr. Vega, my question to the council would be, what makes that an acceptable condition to continue to maintain? So hence our recommendation, I would make a resolution to reiterate our recommendation as presented to council in April of 2018 to adopt the Building Appeals Board version of the city fire map.
So can I ask a question? So are we assuming, Member Daddy, that the city is in a high-severity zone, fire zone? Are we? Extreme. So then insurance rates would be based on that. Is that correct?
Rates and eligibility?
Okay, so then, in that case, we have to apply by these recommendations. The whole city does.
Well, insurance is different. They're doing their own thing. They're not waiting. The
Stay.
map. All the insurance companies
Oh, the
are
insurance
not
companies.
using the 2007 Cal Fire map
Right.
for
I realize.
designation.
Yeah, they all have their different ways they got there. But generally, it's accepted that we are in a very high,
Yeah, we haven't had eligibility above Fairview for years with a half a dozen of major companies. So, I mean, that's been something that's gone on for years and years and years. So
We're-
we've lost eligibility through a fairly large portion of the community.
At this point in time, how would the existing CAL FIRE 2007 map be? Is that strictly Ventura County Fire Department, has nothing to do with the building department? As far as any recommendations or requirements as far as construction materials or methodology?
This section addresses that. That's what this section addresses, for new construction.
Okay, so, and once again, that follows the 2007 map based on the gradients?
This would be applied to that map, yes.
Okay, so in other words, someone on the north side of Pleasant Avenue is in a very high fire hazard map according to the 2007 CAL FIRE, and they'd have a set of hardening.
Residential?
Yes,
Residential?
yeah,
Well,
Doesn't-
that goes under the residential code, which we've already adopted, and they have the hardening plus the additional items that the BAB recommended.
right. But on the south side, where they're in a moderate, fire hazard?
Residential?
Yeah.
Still.
Same
still
thing?
applies. So
Okay.
all residential,
Okay,
and so effectively, what I'm saying is this, we would change, like we did in the residential, we changed new buildings and alterations. So any alteration has to be brought up to this code also, in any severity zone, moderate, high, or very high. That would blanket the city. So
and you're proposing to do that when the code changes?
when the code
having
changes,
it
coming back
already,
in
okay.
August.
All right.
Less than 3 months.
Well, that's predicated on a lot of stuff, okay? That would, correct me if I'm wrong, would be the first time that the city's adopted a building code on time?
Not in 25 years.
Yeah, so, when you say that,
Make it happen.
well, okay, it turns out there's lots of reasons that may not have been initially clear to have this meeting tonight. I gainsay, part of it is planning and preparation for what we're supposed to be doing for the next go-round, because frankly, we already went through this, or I have. I mean, a couple of these folks have done it maybe twice. They got, smacked up the side of the head with the CBC adoption and the city's history of it defaulting for the last, several decades. So I'd like to approach it with a little bit of foresight, a little bit of planning, and a little anticipation. It should go pretty well that way.
Like I said, we should have the code changes ready for a meeting by mid to late August
Okay.
for the BAB review. And if there's any other items that you want to address, let me know in advance so that I can have those sections available for the meeting, that I will have the rest of the sections. I will have what we currently have updated to the current code, to that current code, to the new code. Plus, I will include Chapter 7A as requested, or will be requested, with the same modifications that we have in the residential code applied to this. Then you'll review it all. If there's any other items that you want to include, let me know in advance so that I have those sections available to you to review.
Does anyone see any unintended consequences from this approach? Or end the potential, and the possible potential adoption of course, of addition to?
Well, what I see the intended is we will maybe be current for the first time in 25 years and not always be at least one or more adoptions behind, which we've been.
Okay,
You
right.
know, this thing's going to change every 3 years. The city's just not gotten around to adopting. And so sometimes, I think at one time, we were like 6 years behind.
Yeah, a couple of iterations. Okay, all right. Are there any, at this point, any resolution or direction beyond what I think is, we've reached? Okay, what about my proposed resolution of reiteration regarding adoption of the, yeah, because the council's been letting it swirl for over a year now.
Is that a motion you're making?
Well, it was,
Okay,
yeah,
I second it.
to reiterate the, our recommendation to adopt, that the council adopt.
To make a second request.
Yeah.
To make an additional, to make a current request.
Yeah, 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 that'll work. A year later.
But the problem though, I mean, the problem is that they're not coming through with the fire map. City doesn't create the fire map.
Yes, it's right, it's provided right here.
Yeah, but they're gonna create it? I thought it was created by.
Well, we've already created it. We've already recommended, we've adopted by resolution the recommendation that the map that we created be adopted by the
Oh, the
city.
one that we created, okay.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
they haven't, okay.
Yeah, that was the last you recall.
Yeah, I
You
remember,
didn't,
okay.
yeah, mate, you know, it came and went. We haven't seen it since, so James, I'm sure, knows where it is.
I have it in my office.
Yes.
So.
He's the steward and the archivist, so.
And is that gonna be posted in the front lobby?
Once it would get adopted, we would
We
post
will
it.
do
Yeah,
that?
right now you don't want to confuse the public.
Yeah, I don't want to confuse. Okay, is there more discussion? Oh, okay.
You want to discuss?
Call for the
Okay.
vote.
She's-
All in favor?
Aye?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Okay, it passes.
If I can make one point quickly, I think the people in this room, the BAB members, were also responsible for the first building code being adopted in how many years, 20 years or something this year. So, it's not impossible, I think, with the group we have. So,
Wow.
is that my pep talk?
Thank you. Appreciate that.
I'm really glad we're getting
Now I'm really
somewhere.
confused. So, okay, swell.
Okay.
All right, is
Adjourn
there, whoa, just a minute, something for a discussion item going forward? In other words, a future agendization, perhaps? We were, the issue of encroachment permits as they relate specifically to building permits as a requirement or an adjunct to a building permit.
I would like us to look in 9 when it comes to curbs, gutters, sidewalks being completed prior to building permits, and remove or modify the language in a short sentence, a short session at the next meeting without brushing aside the 2019 adoption. As I looked through that thing, it currently said, we're doing a lot of stuff we can't do. We're given permits for occupancy that we have in our own codes. I'd say absolutely not. We then go ahead and we talk in our codes that under Title IV, that if I'm not happy with what's going on, I can appeal to the city council, which is still referenced. But then when you go to the Title IV, it's deleted. And so I think somewhere in there, we need to get rid of half the book that doesn't apply anymore. Not at the next meeting, just a couple of things at the next meeting. And specific,
Title IV.
that's the appeal to the city council is Title IV.
Yeah. Tom was just saying that we've done the Title IX updates, but I clarified that you're talking about Title IV, so.
Well, Title IV is for the appeal, but
Right.
then when you go to that title in 78, it was removed, so we had to remove that as a reference from
Right.
the other one too. I just don't see how giving a conditional permit waives the hazard from a curb cut in a sidewalk that doesn't meet the ADA requirements. And it appears that for some reason, we don't have timeframes.
Well, and
to
also-
finish up on some of those.
And also, there's a specific category of encroachment permits. I mean, encroachment permits, as issued by the Public Works Department, cover a broad range of things. An event, someone parking a piece of equipment or a dumpster in the city right away, work in the city right away. Actually, it's quite an extensive list. But where my concern is where the work required under an encroachment permit specifically relates to the water, the fire water, the gas, underground electrical, I've already got domestic water, and services that are specifically required and are pertinent to a building permit for a revision or a new construction, it's like it's separated and has a completely different set of standards. An encroachment permit is discretionary, whereas a building permit and certainly a service replacement or new installation is a ministerial permit.
Are you referring to the PAW,
Well, that's part of
is that what
it.
you're referring to?
But when you have a distinction, I could understand an encroachment permit for an event or leaving an obstruction like a roll-off or a concrete rubble lowboy in the city right away as being discretionary. But there's not really anything that should be discretionary about either a requirement under the building code of having potable water and power and, if gas is and certainly sewer, that was the other one I was trying to remember, of course, that would be ironic. In any case, those are requirements, and yet their purview and issuance of an encroachment permit by the Public Works Department is discretionary. That's a disconnect, in my view. So I'd like to, at this point, explore aligning the permitting for building department permits or related to building department permits in a way that makes sense, because also, ostensibly, if there is a cultural resources review, whatever that level is for that particular project, that it applies to, it's not one or two or three different reviews.
I'm just struggling to see how that's a building issue, and I guess your statement was that related to building, but it's really a planning issue, and we could say any planning permits are related to building because they ultimately go to building, but
No, it's not planning at all. Under the building code, of the California Building Code, correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Jesuiak, you have to have a provision for sewer. And if you're in a sewage treatment or removal from the two pillars of civilization, potable water and sewer. And there may be some other things we don't really have entertained that I'm aware of, anyone who is so totally off the grid in the city that they don't have some connection to an agency service. And as such, that makes it a requirement under the building code. So from my perspective, it's not a Title 10 issue. And it seems there's a disconnect when it's a discretionary permit issued by the Public Works Department.
And I think, again, so that just the last part of that sentence, it's a discretionary permit issued by the Public Works Department. So Public Works Director decisions aren't appealable to the Board of Appeals, or the Building Appeals Board. So I don't see where the connection would be that would get that. It could be a
so the
planning
criteria we're looking
commission.
at whether we, because it's that way doesn't make it right, right?
Right, but the jurisdiction of the Building
Yeah,
Appeals Board
and
is
we
specific.
had lots of Title X issues in the in Ojai City, or the OMC ordinances, that we went, this should be in Title X.
But they were in Title IX
Correct.
currently. This section is not.
Correct. Well, what I'm saying is, from a practical perspective, and because of this, your arguments sound to a point. I gainsay, and unfortunately, we haven't heard from the Planning Commission about whether they've read the entirety of Title X and they've seen Title IX issues that should be coming back on this side of things. Bottom line on it is, my experience with the Ojai Municipal Code is there's a lot of, as was referenced there in Title IV, a lot of inconsistencies, a lot of stuff that was adopted in 1968 and that was
68.
subsequently, what's the term that was used for when it's,
Arcane.
not revoked, it's, no. What was that?
Repealed or
Repealed,
deleted.
exactly, that's what I'm looking for. Repealed in 1978 or 1982, regardless. There's an interest from my perspective, and I think I share this with at least some of the members of the Building Appeals Board, in aligning the city's mechanism and ordinances so that they're more functional rather than arcane and eccentric, and having run into it myself, sort of dysfunctional. Okay, so that I'll ponder that your assertion, but the bottom line on it is, once again, don't make it right just because that's the way it got set up, as was evidenced by the Title X stuff that was in Title IX that we pushed over to where it belongs.
Yeah,
So,
I think for me, the typical first step would be to ask the Planning Commission to review that and determine if it's something that.
I
Building Appeals Board should
indirectly
weigh in.
just did, so, I indirectly just did. Okay, anything else? All right, we're gonna adjourn this at 7:12. Thank you.
We were so glad to get out of here, and the guy that was the Public Works Director said, "Doesn't matter to me. I gotta get up tomorrow and do the same thing." Right. So, it's over for our committee.
Signature.